And we're now moving into the session 2 videos, and we're primarily going to be focusing on letters of recommendation. And this is a very important part of the graduate school process, not only because of the importance of the letters of recommendation, but also the fact that how you ask for them and how you choose who's going to write them for you can have a fairly large effect on the success of your applications to graduate school. So we're going to be talking about letters of recommendation, kind of what goes into them, but primarily we're going to be talking about what you can do to make sure you get the best letters that you possibly can. And again, this is one of those situations where the earlier you start, and by earlier I'm even talking freshman, sophomore, or junior year, the more likely you are that you can build up relationships with the right people so that you can get really good letters of recommendation. But if you haven't done that, if you're a senior, keep calm, stay motivated. You can still kind of subjectively and objectively think about who do I want to get letters from and how can I give them information to make sure those letters are better and are helping my application, not necessarily hurting my application. So we're going to basically talk about who you should ask and when you should ask. And the when is fairly simple, and we already talked about this in some of the previous videos that you've hopefully watched, and that is with that timeline in the fall semester. You want to give at least 3 to 4 weeks notice before any of your actual letters are due. And again, your letter writer should have all of the information that they need to be able to write you that letter. They should have a copy of your personal statement, they should have a copy of your CV, they should have an unofficial copy of your transcripts, your grades. They should have a list of every program you're applying to, the actual university's name, the actual program's name, how they're supposed to submit that letter, and finally when the due date is. So when you look at that packet, you want to make sure that they have that packet with at least 3 to 4 weeks notice from the first one that is actually due. So that's the when. Now the who becomes a little bit more complex, and we're going to try to get into that and give you as much information as possible. So the first thing I want to point out is just how important letters of recommendation are. They are probably this third thing that a graduate program is going to look at. And generally speaking, graduate programs typically look at GPA and GRE first. And the reason for this is it's a very easy thing to look at. It doesn't require a whole bunch of cognitive time. You're not having to read a bunch of letters or statements. You can just look at the number, and the number is on a common metric. People know what a GPA is. People know what a GRE is. And people know what a high GPA or a high GRE score is. So when you're looking at programs, remember that for the most part, most psychology graduate programs are competitive. They have a fairly high rejection rate, which means that the people that are making these decisions, the actual decision committee deciding who gets into the graduate program, has a lot of applications to look at. I'm just going to use my own self for an example here. Typically, I will be looking at 50 to 60 applications for 10 openings in our program every year. And that means that at least initially, it's hard not to use GPA and GRE as a bit of a rule of thumb to kind of sort through which people should I be looking at a little bit more in detail. And honestly, a lot of times that doesn't mean that I'm going to reject you based on your GPA or your GRE. But if those numbers are low, you've got now the job of convincing me why I should ignore them. And I'm going to look to see, do you? But also, if that's a moderate, if you have moderate scores, that means I may be putting a little bit more time looking at the rest of your application materials. Do I see more support for your application in those additional materials? So that's really where these letters of recommendation come in. So if you have a great GPA and a great GRE, you're probably already kind of at the top of the stack. And in that case, really your letters of recommendation just have to continue to support that trend. But if you have not the greatest GRE, or a good GRE but not the greatest GPA, or some combination therein, the letters of recommendation can really make or break an application. They are the next thing that are looked at, and really good letters of recommendation go far in pushing your application forward. So this is just a quick actual set of data from a study that was looking at how important letters of recommendation were to the selection process. And take a look at these percentages. So in doctoral programs, both public and private, over 80% rated the letters of recommendation as highly important in their decision on who to let into graduate school. In master's degree programs, public and private, we're at 76 to 81, so almost the same percentages. So you can kind of see just how important these letters of recommendation are. I think a lot of undergraduates applying to graduate school tend to think they just need 3 letters. It's just a numbers game. As long as I've got the 3 that the program asks me for, then I'm good. No, these really are important, and you need to do whatever you can to try to make sure that you've got good letters of recommendation. Now, a quick note on how many letters. Most programs are going to have a requirement that you have 3 letters of recommendation. Really check their language carefully. Some programs may only require 1 or 2 letters of recommendation. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad program, but I would be a little concerned. Why are they requiring less information than the norm for them to make their decision? Also, some programs may actually say 3 or more. So if they specifically say 3 letters of recommendation, I would suggest you send 3. Some undergraduates will ask me, how many letters should I send? Send the number they ask for. However, if you actually do have more than 3 potential letter writers and you have a program that says 3 or more, I don't think it's a bad idea to potentially send a 4th letter. That's up to you. That's your call. Just recognize, don't send a 4th letter if they don't ask for it. So like I said, the letters of recommendation are right behind the GPA and the GRE and their ratings of importance, and this has been found time and time again in studies of actually decision makers, the people that are deciding who gets into graduate programs. So the next thing we want to ask is, how do you ask? So because that's, again, it's a simpler question than who. So how do you ask? You should ask in person. And you should at least allow that in-person interaction. So again, you may open up the conversation with an email, but that email should request an in-person meeting. Now, again, the faculty member may just simply say, especially if they already were expecting a request for a letter of recommendation, or if they already know they can write you a good one, they may say, there's really no need for us to meet. I'd be happy to write you a letter. However, give them the opportunity to agree to that personal meeting. And if you do get that personal meeting, really pay attention to how they're responding to your request. If their body language says that they're not necessarily convinced that they should be writing you a letter, if they're saying yes, but they don't seem excited about writing the letter, if they're not asking you a lot of questions about where you're applying to, read that body language. Again, you would rather, again, how do I put this? It's better to have 3 not very good but not bad letters than not have 3 letters at all. If you need 3 letters, you need 3 letters. But ideally, you want 3 letters that are going to be basically wowing the admissions committee. You don't want a letter that's going to be lackluster. So one of the reasons that you want to ask in person, especially if you're not 100% sure the person would be able to write you a good letter, is to get a feel for that in that in-person interview. Remember that you're asking for the favor, but you're also asking for them to help you. And you may want to ask more than 3 to figure out who's going to be able to write the best letters. Now, a lot of people actually ask me, what is the perfect letter of recommendation? And I can tell you what a good letter of recommendation looks like, and I can tell you what a poor letter looks like. But I can't tell you what a moderate one looks like, because every selection committee kind of has their own pet peeves. So let me just broadly talk about what is a great letter of recommendation. A great letter of recommendation comes from a faculty member, preferably an established faculty member, so an associate or a full professor. They should have knowledge of the area you're applying to, so they should understand the types of programs you're applying to, and ideally their specialization should be in the area you're planning to go into. The more published they are, the more known they are in the area, also the better for you. Finally, how detailed of a letter can they write you? How much do they know about you? Have they had you in multiple classes? Have they had conversations with you about graduate school? Have you worked in their research lab? Have you worked as a research assistant? Were you involved in a psychology club that they were the supervisor for? All of those are going to add to the letter's quality. Now, what is a poor letter of recommendation? A poor letter of recommendation comes from a non-academic with no knowledge of your area that really doesn't know much about how you've performed as a student and as a professional. So these are often family members, sometimes they're bosses. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is absolutely, you can never use a letter of recommendation from one of those sources. But again, just recognize that you're getting towards the bottom. Now, when I said I can't tell you what a moderate one is, this is where it starts to become kind of personal preference. So let's say, for instance, you actually have a family member, but they actually know the field. They know about you as a student, and they actually write a 2-page letter that makes a very strong argument about why you'd be a great graduate student. Now, they're not a faculty member, they're not a professor, they're not known, but they actually wrote a really good letter. Is that letter going to be better than a full professor in the area who writes you a single paragraph saying they did well in a class, I'd let them in? I don't know. Because again, different faculty members in selection committees are going to have different things they're looking at. Some are going to be impressed by the fact it's a full professor, but some are going to be, well, I don't care if they're a full professor, this letter isn't very good. And some people are going to be like, wow, this letter is really good. While other people are going to be, yeah, the letter is good, but I don't necessarily know if the person who wrote it is someone we should be listening to. So I hope you're kind of seeing where there's that gray zone. You want to move as much as you can to having 3 letters from established faculty members in your field that can write you a good letter. But very few people are going to have 3 people that fit that perfect category. Just again, recognize that when you're asking a faculty member, if you see hesitancy, accept that as a no, unless you have really no choice. So you should be asking people, who are you asking? You should be asking people based on how well they know you, how good of a letter they can or will write for you, a little bit about what their title is, and also will others know them. So you want to find people that are known in the field to some degree. So again, this is kind of that seesaw where we really don't have a right answer, but if you had 4 people that you were wanting to write letters for, and you were trying to decide which of the final 2 to choose, and one of them you know is fairly well published in the field that you're wanting to go into, that might make that decision for you. Likewise, if you have 2 faculty members and both of them are kind of equal under everything else, but one of them is a full professor and one of them is a fairly new assistant professor, again, I would probably go with the full professor. So there is no one right answer, but you do, again, just like everything we've been talking about, you want to be thinking about it kind of like a scientist. Figure out what factors are important, try to kind of rate your various potential letter writers on these, and make your decisions based on who's more likely to be giving you letters that are going to be taken seriously. So how not to ask for a letter? It should not be informal, it shouldn't be impersonal, and honestly also it shouldn't be someone that may not even remember who you are. So here's an example. Hi, I was in your intro psych class back in 1982, long time no see. You gave me a B. I graduated in 1985 and have decided to go back to graduate school. Can you believe it? Attached is a form you need to fill out. Thank you. So there's a lot wrong with this sentence. The first one is you're asking someone that only knows you, even if they remember you from so far back, from an intro class. Again, ideally you want professors that you took advanced classes with. Long time no see. You're very informal. You gave me a B. Right there, that actually, not only did I not do great in the class, I'm not even taking credit for the fact that I didn't get an A. I'm accusing you of giving me a B. Decided to go back to grad school. Can you believe it? Again, we go to informal. And finally, an assumption the person's just going to say yes. This is the kind of request that I am likely to actually write a letter for, but I'm going to basically write a letter and say the person very informally asked me for a letter of recommendation. I honestly don't remember them from an intro class that they took more than 2 decades ago. I know nothing about their academic performance. I suppose you should look at their other materials to decide if they're a good fit. That's not me being mean, that's me being honest. And that's me being honest about someone that assumed I'd write a letter without even bothering to talk to me. This is important. Letters of recommendation shouldn't be treated frivolously. This is again just another how not to do it. Attached to recommendation forms for 7 graduate programs I'm applying to. Notice the first one is due next week. You'll have to get to it right away. Again, we have this assumption that you're going to do it. No information about how you know this person. And basically just, well, I think you get the point. This is not how we're supposed to do it. What you're wanting to do is basically ask for a meeting, and basically it can be something like an email that says, I hope that you remember me. I was in your following classes. I worked in the following thing. And again, if they obviously know you, you wouldn't be, I hope you remember me. But you do want to basically introduce yourself in the email. Say, I've really been considering graduate school and I'd love to have a meeting with you to discuss my options. So that also gives you the opportunity to ask real questions of the faculty member of what their advice would be for you applying to grad school. And it allows you now to ask for the letter in person. And again, they may very well respond with, are you asking for a letter of recommendation? If so, yes. And if you have a good feeling about that, go ahead and accept. But it gives you the option to do that in person, and I think that really is important. So if you can avoid it, don't ask letters of recommendation from professors whom you've had problems or gotten mediocre grades with. And again, my own personal experience is I've had C and D students send me an email asking for letters of recommendation. I had a student once that basically flunked a class, and it's the only class they had with me, but they did meet with me in my office to complain about it. They asked me for a letter of recommendation. Don't be one of these students. The professors should be people you've taken advanced classes from, and again, if at all possible, avoid asking friends and relatives. If you are in a situation where you do not have 3 professors who are familiar with your field and familiar with graduate programs writing letters, if you are having to rely on a friend, a relative, or an outside employer, I would suggest that you take a look at the links that are available through this Blackboard course. There is an article on how to write letters of recommendation. It is really strongly suggested that if you have someone that's a non-professor write you a letter, don't just ask them to write a letter, because most non-academic letters of recommendation are very short and do not contain the information that selection committees are looking for. You need to ask them, are you willing to write me a letter of recommendation? And before you say yes, this is an academic letter. It's about a 2-page document that talks about my ability to succeed as a graduate student. If you're interested, I can give you some samples and I can give you a short article that'll tell you how to write one of these letters. Are you willing? Because again, it's not going to be as good a letter as you could get from a professor who knows you well, but it's going to be better than if you didn't take those steps. So again, don't assume a professor will write a letter, and don't put the professor's name down that they are as a reference until they've agreed to write letters. And also, don't simply just mail or email the request and then leave the materials in the faculty member's mailbox. Make sure that you attempt to see that professor in person and have that in-person exchange, not just about asking them to write you a letter, but also, again, using them as a resource to make sure that you're getting as much information as you can about what you should be doing to get into the programs of your choice.